back in the early 20s, that was the very latest style. You know, that was cool. To just have your hair cut straight up, the skin straight up the sides like this.
Yeah.
And then long enough to comb on top.
Right.
And he never got out of that habit until he got to be an old man, and then he had it cut real short. You know,
because he lost a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of hair.
But from my earliest memories, he wore a hat when he went out. He wore a fairly narrow brim felt fedora, snap brim, you know. And the brim was kind of curled up in the back and snapped down in front. And that's the kind of hat he wore, always. He had a brown one and a gray one. And
he switched them off.
And he switched them off, whatever clothes he was wearing.
Yeah.
And even when we lived in Beaumont on Madison Street, just a half a block from the entrance to the refinery.
Right.
I was 4 years old, and 5, I guess, before we left there. And he was working in the coke stills in the refinery, and you know. And they went in those when there was a batch operation. You know, they put crude oil in there and cook it, and get the gasoline and diesel fuel and all of that kind of stuff. And what was left was just hard, like coal, only it was coke. They called it coke. Just a layer of it on the bottom of those stills. And his crew would go in there and break that stuff up and dig it out. And so he was just black from head to foot, you know, when the whistle blew to quit for the day. But he would go to the bathhouse after the whistle blew. He would go to the bathhouse and shower and clean up and put on his suit and tie and hat to come home in. When he went to work in the morning, he put on a suit and tie and hat and went to work, and then changed into his work clothes after he got there. And all my life he did that. The last 20 years he worked, well, that was the kind of clothes he worked in. He was working in the office as a timekeeper. But he believed in looking dapper when he went out, when he left the house.
And that's probably part of what the Crawfords taught him.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, because they were that way.
They sure were.
Yes, sir, they sure were. And Grandma Crawford told me when I was a little kid, you know, 8 years old or something like that. She said, if you want to get ahead in the world, you make sure your teeth are brushed and your shoes are shined when you go out.
Hard to shine sneakers.
Well, but I didn't. Well, that's true.
But she meant when you got older. Yeah.
When you had dress shoes, if you had dress shoes,
Right.
If you had dress shoes, leather shoes, they were to be shined.
Yeah.
I grant you. And and that's another lady that educated me was Miss Jinks. You remember Miss Jinks?
Of course I remember Miss Jinks.
Yeah. I remember one time we were in town.
This was just a friend of the family.
Yeah, I went to church at the Methodist church with our family, and we were in Beaumont, and it was time, you know, as in like the end of August, getting ready for school to start. And of course, I'd been barefooted since March or February, somewhere along in there, and we were going to go to town. Went to Beaumont to get what we had to have to go to school. And one of the things that I had to have was a pair of shoes, a pair of tennis shoes. And so we went to town, and my mother made me wash my feet real good before we went to town, and carry a pair of socks with me. And we went into the Guarantee shoe store. You know these high top tennis shoes with the round rubber thing right on the ankle bone?
Right.
You could buy those for 48 cents a pair at the Guarantee shoe store.
Really?
Yeah, black. They were black with white rubber, black canvas with white rubber. And so we went in there to the Guarantee shoe store, you know, and I put on my socks, and they found a pair of tennis shoes that fit me, you know, and laced them up and tied them and gave me the box, and Mama paid the 48 cents, and we left. And when we come out onto the sidewalk, we met Miss Jinx.
Okay.
And she said, I see you're wearing your new shoes out of the store. You know that's country, don't you? You don't go into a shoe store and buy a new pair of shoes and wear them out.
So you learned a lesson.
I learned a lesson that day. I never did that again.
Oh, dear. Yeah, I remember the jeans.
And we'd, it was a curious thing. You'd wear shoes most of the winter. You know, we'd actually at home, you know, when we come in from school, we'd take our shoes off, and on weekends we went without them up through October. But in November, when we started to have cold mornings, even frost on the ground, well, we didn't go barefooted outside, and we'd wear our shoes all the time. And by the end of February, the soles of your feet are so tender that you just can't hardly walk outside barefoot, especially on pavement that might be hot, or on gravel that's got sharp points. But just in a week or two,
They were toughened up.
they tough up, man, and by the end of the summer, you could strike a match on the sole of your foot. That was strange. They sure would get tender over the winter, but it didn't take long for them to toughen up.
Well, how did working in the Coke distillery mix in with being a part of the Magnolia Band?
The Magnolia Band was kind of an extracurricular thing.
Okay.
The Magnolia Refinery, a lot of the larger companies had different things like that. Had the Magnolia Petroleum Company had a basketball team, a semi-pro basketball team, and a baseball team, and a band, a marching band that they sponsored. And the company provided the uniforms, and with regard to the band, they provided the instruments, you know. And when they went to perform, like they went to the State Fair in Dallas and marched in the parade and played
I didn't
concerts.
know they marched.
Yeah,
Okay, I never heard that.
yeah, and played concerts, and the company paid their expenses when they did that. But they didn't get paid for being in the band, for performing. That was strictly a volunteer deal.
Well, where did he learn to play his horn?
He learned to play his horn in Tennessee in the Reform School.
Oh, okay.
He was in the band, in the students' band at that school that he was in. And that's why he ran away with Ham Crawford
Yeah,
with the circus, because he could play in the circus band.
That's true, yeah.
He got a job with the circus
Right.
as soon as he graduated from high school. And then when he came home with Ham to Tyler, and the war started, well, he enlisted in the Army and was in the band, not the official Army band, but in the 144th Infantry
Yeah.
Band. And but again, that service in the band, in the Army, he was still an infantryman.
Yeah.
And had the training, went through the training went through the infantry training.
Basic training.
Yeah, for and AID, what they call AIT now, the Advanced Infantry Training.
Okay.
And so when they got to France, the band would form up and play and march and all that kind of stuff in the back areas, you know, back away from the front. But when they went to the front, he was an infantryman.
And what did he say that? He said something about knowing what a artillery sounded like.
Yeah, what an artillery barrage sounds like. Yeah. Yeah, he didn't. He never did talk about it. See, when I was 10 years old, say, he'd been out of the World War I had been over for 20 years. That was a double lifetime for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't even imagine anything that happened, that might have happened that far back in history, and 20 years ago. And but he never talked about it, and our family life was such that we knew better than to ask. I grew up convinced that my daddy knew everything about everything, and it never would enter my mind to question anything he did, or to ask him about personal things like that, and none of the other kids would have either. An example of that, we were at the Norton's house. You know the Nortons up in Tyler? You and I tried to go to their house and wound up in Benwheeler one time.
Right.
Okay. We were out there on that highway at the Norton's house.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, it was just mopping me.
Okay.
And we got ready to leave and go back into Tyler. And so we got in the car and we drove out the driveway and turned onto the highway, and as a pickup truck with his brakes locked up, sliding, going off toward the ditch to keep from hitting us, T-boning us right in my door. And we pulled out on the highway and took off, and my daddy said, "Did you see that truck coming?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Why didn't you say something?" And I didn't have an answer for him. I would not have dared to say anything. I mean, he would never make a mistake. And so I assumed he deliberately drove out in front of that truck. And I wasn't going to say, "Hey, you're not supposed to do that."
Oh dear. So you almost got T-boned.
Almost. Yeah, it kind of upset him because I hadn't said anything when I saw that truck coming. He couldn't figure that out. I was always afraid that something I would do or say would upset him, make him mad. When he got mad, he got mad. But one thing, he had one absolute ironclad rule. He would never punish one of us while he was still mad. He'd wait till he got over the mad completely before he'd punish us. But he could go off like a volcano, I'll tell you.
Like? Like somebody I know?
Oh, no.
Oh.
No, I learned way, before I was 10 years old, I learned to not lose my temper in the presence of my parents.
Oh, in the presence of your parents, okay.
Yes, sir. You bottled it up and held it inside. It hurt. Man, my stomach could hurt so bad. But you just didn't, throw a temper fit. I remember one time we was working in the garden, just he and I. And we'd been out there for several hours. It was probably 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday. And he had got a row. We gardened about at least an acre of land, maybe more than an acre. And so we had a row that was 400 feet long, and he had it all. There wasn't a weed, blade of grass anywhere in that garden. The only thing you could see, the only thing green was plants that he had planted. And so he got this row ready to plant some beans or something in. And he got it. I mean, it was all shaped up there like that, and worked up real fine. And he went right down the middle with the corner of his hoe and opened a little V-shaped groove right down the middle of that row, 400 feet long. And he said, go in the kitchen. He told me, he said, go in the kitchen, and in the right-hand cabinet on the top shelf, there's a sack in there with beans in it. You bring the beans. Bring that sack of beans. Put 2 beans about every 6 inches in this row. And so I went and got the sack of beans. Went in there, and got a sack, and it had beans in it. I went out there, and I'm putting 2 beans 6 inches apart in that row. I'm over halfway down the row. He was over there doing something else, and he come around to close up the gap and looked in the groove, and it was the wrong beans.
Oh my gosh.
And he come up there where I was, and he got that sack, and he throwed it 400 feet out into the pasture and shook his fist at the sky, and I'm not going to tell you what all he said. And I'm telling you, I just melted into the ground. He wasn't mad at me. He was mad because he hadn't explained which sack to get, and I'd put the wrong beans in the row. And after about a minute and a half, he stopped, turned around and said, "Why don't you go into the house and take the rest of the day off?" And he went back to what he was doing. I want you to know there was beans this tall halfway across that pasture, just in a row like that. Where he had thrown them, and they'd spilled out of that sack as they went.
Oh dear. Ah yes, such is life. Such is
But
life.
other times he could be so calm and cool. And in crisis situations, we cooked. My mother did all her cooking on a wood cook stove, and we heated the house with wood, with a wood stove. We had a wood heater in the living room, and this huge cast iron cook stove in the kitchen. Every morning he'd get up and build a fire in that cook stove, And in the wintertime he'd build one in the heater in the living room. Well, we had to cut wood so we'd have fuel. We owned over 40 acres over there on South Main Street with pine. It was pine forest, and the trees was 14, 16 inches in diameter. and 90 feet tall. And every Saturday, my brother and I and Mop would go to the woods Saturday morning. As soon as we finished breakfast, we'd go out there in the woods, and he'd pick out a tree, and we'd cut it down, trim the limbs off of it with an axe, and saw it up into blocks about 14 inches long, and haul the blocks up to the house. And that's how my brother learned to drive when he was about 11, 12. We had a four-door Model A Ford, and you take the seats out of the back, the upright and the cushion, out of the back seat, and we'd load those blocks of wood, you know, that's 16 inches in diameter and 14 inches long. Just stack them in there plumb up to the ceiling of that old Ford, and my brother would drive it back through the woods in between them trees, you know, up to the house, and we'd unload them blocks. And my daddy would split them up with an axe, and us boys would stack them up in ricks and cords where they could dry, and that's what we used for fuel. Well, he and I, after my brother went to the Navy, he and I were in the woods. We had pretty well thinned out that 40 acres of pine woods by then. And we was right up pretty close to the road. There was still some pretty good sized pine trees there. And we was cutting one down and gonna drop it straight away from the road into the woods. And so we got it notched on that side and was cross-cut sawing it this way, and it started leaning the wrong way, back toward the road and the power lines.
Oh, boy.
And so it had already trapped, as it leaned back, it had already trapped the saw, the cross-cut saw, into the cut. We couldn't get it out. We just left it there. And my daddy got the axe and run around on the roadside and chopped it into that tree as high up as he could, and was pushing, trying to keep it from falling.
Wow.
But it had too much weight, too much momentum, and he couldn't stop it. And so finally he just had to pull the axe out and move out of the way, and it went onto the line, and you know, showers of sparks and popping noises and lines falling, and it didn't go all the way through them. It caught, some of them finally caught it and stopped it, you know, so it's leaning on those lines. But several of the lines were on the ground. And he said, go to the house and tell your mother. We didn't have a telephone, so go down to the Joneses' house, which was the first house back toward Vida from ours. They had a telephone, and call the Gulf States and tell them what's happened. And I took off running, and was veering toward the road, you know, to go down the road up the driveway to the house. And he said, no, don't cross those lines on the ground.
Oh, okay.
Go the back way.
Okay.
And so I went down through the pasture and got to the house. But he wasn't the least bit upset, or didn't indicate that he was the least bit upset about it. It happened, and you know, the thing to do now was deal with it, not throw a fit because it had happened.
He was talking about the 40s truck. Tell him about the truck we saw today.
So a 1940 Ford pickup truck.
Wow.
Shiny.
It was restored, yeah, it was restored, and it was chopped and channeled. It was sitting way down low on the ground.
Yeah, it was coming down 105.
Yeah, just before we got to old 90 there.
Yeah. It was neat looking.
Yeah,
David should have saw it.
I don't like I don't like the modified ones. I like them restored just like they were built. That's the way I prefer them. Have you seen the thing on TV, on the news about this guy in Nebraska that had a Chevrolet dealership, He was a car salesman, par none. Nobody could compare with him. He could sell Chevrolets to anybody that come down the road. But he was not a businessman. And he sold Chevrolets for 50 years there in that little town in Nebraska, and took cars in trade. And these trade-ins he took out and lined up in his pasture. Row on row, dozens and dozens of them. They're still sitting there.
Well, they said there were some new ones mixed up in them.
No, he said there's some that had never been driven.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah, they're not new. There's a few 50 up as far as 57, 58.
Okay.
But none newer than that I saw on in those shots that we saw. That just been sitting there ever since. You know, they're rusted. The tires have rotted off of them, and so on and so forth. But they're restorable, and they're worth a lot of money. And they're having an auction.
Yeah.
They're going to auction all of them off. Was it going to be today or tomorrow? I guess tomorrow. They're going to have the auction this weekend, and sell those things off. The 1940 model, the 40s and 50s model cars, Chevrolets, Fords, Buicks, all different kinds of cars.
Wow.
Man alive.
That's
What if Brother David saw that ad?
He ain't gonna. Well, no, he's not gonna go to Nebraska.
No.
He's going somewhere to celebrate his wedding anniversary.
Yeah, I knew that.
But it's not.
Nebraska's where he had a church one time.
I know it.
Well, I've always just been curious. Did Mop what kind of voice did he have? Because I haven't heard him.
He was not a singer.
He was not.
I don't think I've ever heard him sing other than just ditties entertaining us kids. He was not a singer. His voice was I suspect, I don't know, because you know, it's my voice sounds different to me than it does to anybody else. Do you remember the first time you ever heard your voice recorded? No.
But I remember
Just hearing your own voice recorded. The reason I ask is because I can distinctly remember the first time I heard my recorded voice, and I said, that's not me. I don't know who that is, but it's not me. I never heard that voice before in my life. Well, but I suspect that my daddy's voice was very much like mine, and if he was exasperated or upset or anything, it changed, and it got hard. You could chisel stone with it, and he could say, you know, words that were not offensive or insulting, but the sound of his voice was. You understand what I'm saying? She knows what I'm saying. It was, yeah. But and as far as his musical ability was concerned, he could play any brass instrument. But he was a mechanic. He had to have the music in front of him. You know, he knew which valves to press to make a certain note, to blow a certain note. And if it said blow that note, that's what he did. And if it said blow it for this long, that's what he did. And he was very capable as a trumpet player or trombone or any of the tubas or bass horns, sousaphones or anything like that. I assumed that he had played cornet as well. I don't think he ever played French horn, which is not really considered a brass instrument, I don't think. I'm not sure. I think it's in a class all by itself. It's got rotary valves instead of the kind that you just press.
That's what Mark played.
Yeah. but he always said, I don't know how it turned out that he wound up most of his career, musical career, playing a big bass horn. But he always said, if you're going to be in the marching band in school, if you want to play an instrument in the band, play the piccolo.
Play the piccolo.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You can put it in your shirt pocket when you're not playing, when you march.
That's true.
That's what he said.
I remember I had to play the saxophone.
Yeah.
And so starting out, they didn't exactly have the best padding on the neck strap.
Yeah.
And so you'd wear your neck out,
Yeah.
walking around with that heavy thing on your neck all day.
It's funny how you have to build up calluses or something.
Mm-hmm.
When I first went in the Navy, I went to San Diego, California in January, and believe it or not, it's pretty chilly in Southern California in January. And they issued us our uniforms, dungarees and chambray shirts, and they issued us a navy blue wool jersey, turtleneck jersey, long sleeve, that we wore under our shirt. And that was the uniform of the day, was dungaree pants and that navy blue wool turtleneck jersey and a chambray shirt and in Southern California in January. And they issued us our uniforms, dungarees and chambray shirts, and they issued us a navy blue wool jersey, turtleneck jersey, long sleeve, that we wore under our shirt. And that was the uniform of the day, was dungaree pants and that navy blue wool turtleneck jersey and a chambray shirt and a white hat, little white, funny looking hat. And that wool turtleneck was just like sandpaper. It would take the hide off your neck right across here. Every one of us, there was 160 of us in that company, every one of us had that dark red raw streak from ear to ear right across here. Boy, I'm telling you, that was the sorest thing. But eventually, by the time we graduated from boot camp, after 8 weeks, it didn't bother you anymore. You developed a callus there. Mm.
And you had mentioned before that you had been inside a ship when they were riveting it, when they were operating on a ship. We had talked, me and Uncle Mike and Dad were talking at Cracker Barrel when we were there last time, and mentioned one of the World War II advertisements, the Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that you knew what that process was, and had been inside when the sparks were going.
Yeah.
Well, I had read that the St. Paul had returned to San Diego because it had collided with another ship. And I was just curious if you were in the St. Paul when it was being repaired.
No.
Okay.
No. The St. Paul collided with a Chinese LST.
Okay.
In the Huangpu River off of Shanghai, right at Shanghai. I don't know how much damage she sustained, but you're right. She had to come back to the U.S. to the shipyard for repairs to her hull. But I wasn't aboard when that happened.
Right.
nor when the repairs took place. I went aboard St. Paul in January of 40. Let's see. I believe it was in January, and she was tied up at Terminal Island at a pier in Terminal Island, California. That's in San Diego Harbor. I mean Los Angeles Harbor, and we were there tied up for about 10 days, and then sailed for the South Pacific. Went first to Honolulu to Pearl Harbor, and then on to Japan, and
January of what? You said January.
January 47.
47.
Yeah. And went to Japan, and then went to the North China Sea. The fleet anchorage along the northern China coast was at Tsingtao, China, and we anchored out in the harbor. And when we went ashore, we used these LCMs. You know, the boats that they show the troops going ashore at Normandy during the D-Day landings. That same boat that the front end will drop down like that. They also had a ladder that if you're standing in that well, you could climb up a ladder to the side of it, and so we used those for Liberty boats. And they'd come alongside the ship and get 30 or 40 men just standing in that well, and run them over here to the fleet landing, and pull up there, and you'd have to climb up the ladder to get on the pier to go into town. And so we were there operating in and out of that harbor there at Tsingtao for about 6 months, operating along the northern coast and central coast of China with a British, usually with a British cruiser, and there were a couple of U.S. destroyers and a couple of British corvettes operating with us as well. Just doing exercises, you know, steaming and chasing each other and things like that, and gunnery practice and all of that. And then it got to where you could go on Liberty in Tsingtao and walk down the street, especially at night after dark, and you could hear firefights in the suburbs, rifle fire, you know, just a whole bunch of it, with the communists and the nationalist Chinese shooting at each other. And it got close enough to where they finally decided it wasn't safe for us to be there anymore. And they moved the fleet anchorage to Shanghai. We had to go up the Huangpu River to get to Shanghai. It wasn't on the coast. And so we would go up. When they first said we got to move the anchorage, they sent us to find a new anchorage. And this was one of the most interesting things that occurred, I guess, during that whole cruise. Was we would go up into the China, approach the China coast, and there's a whole lot of the North China coast has little islands right up against the mainland, you know, little channels around them. And we'd go into in between these islands, trying to find a port that we could use, you know, that was a sheltered harbor, a lee harbor, and big enough and deep enough for the Navy to use. I guess they would build the facilities if they needed to, but we couldn't find anything like that. But we saw some interesting countryside and those. I can't remember what they call those things. That you've seen pictures of paintings or paintings, Chinese paintings of these little islands that just stand straight up, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and we'd go in there. The water was so clear and blue, and when we'd try to turn to get back out, you know, and they'd run the screws backwards like that, and it'd boil the water up from way down deep inside, and them jellyfish bigger than this chair, yeah, this big around, literally, would be brought up to the surface, and we'd see them in the water there. You know, that we'd seen jellyfish down here at McFadden Beach about this big around, and that was a big one, you know. These things were bigger than a number 3 wash tub. It was amazing. But they finally gave up trying to find one, and we went to Shanghai. So we'd go up the Huangpu River, and then we'd have to turn and get headed back down the river. And you had to have tugboats do that because you're scraping mud at both sides of the river, you know, with the stern and the bow. When you're turning, that thing is 635 feet long or whatever. And then we'd anchor right in the center of the river, forward and aft. And it would be us and the British destroyer, or us and a British cruiser, or another of our cruisers. We sailed with the USS Fall River, which was also a Baltimore class heavy cruiser part of the time, and we sailed with the Atlanta, which was a light cruiser part of the time. And but we had to have a man on watch on the gangway. They'd put the gangway down, and then it had a platform down close to the water line where the little boats could come up to it, and we'd get in it to go over to the fleet landing. And had to have a watch on that gangway down there on that platform because there was bodies coming down the river pretty much all the time.
Excuse me. You don't need a glass of milk and peanut butter and jelly or something, do you?
I don't need one, no ma'am.
Could you handle one?
I could if you
I could probably handle one.
if you put one in front of me, I'd eat it.
Yeah.
Y'all come in here and talk, and I'll feed you one.
I thought she was just absolutely rapt, just engrossed in what I was saying, and she was thinking about what she's going to feed us. That beats all I was on my mind. Anyway, stand on the gangway down there with a boat hook and twist those bodies away so they wouldn't hang up on the gangway. And the Chinese had somebody, usually in the morning, 2 or 3 of them maybe, in what we call bum boats. It's a little boat that has a sculling oar at the back. Okay, one oar lock right on the transom, pointing out the back of the boat, and a long oar, and it's tied. It's got a rope on this handle end and tied down there in the boat somewhere, and he holds that rope and holds the oar, and he pulls the rope and pushes the oar, and then he pushes the rope and pulls the oar, and what that does is that it turns a blade like that as it's coming this way, which makes the boat go forward. And then when he pulls the rope the other direction, it turns a blade like that when he's pushing it that way. And that's how you make it go forward. That's kind of weird, but that's how they get around. And they'd have 2 or 3 of those patrolling along the docks there at Shanghai, catching those bodies and hauling them somewhere and putting them.
And they were from the Civil War,
I
I
don't
guess.
know what they were from. It was from criminal activity, and some of it was war and all of that. But it was an everyday affair that they'd gather up 2 or 3 of them. They'd come down the river during the night
And was that something that you experienced walking in the street and hearing gunfire, or is that word that was being passed around?
No, I've heard it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounded like firecrackers, you know, going off by strings. Yeah. And when we went to Japan, that Tokyo Bay is a big place. You got Tokyo over here with 8 million people in it, and Yokohama about halfway down the bay, and Yokosuka down at the southern end of the bay, and that's 40 miles. You know, from the south end of that one to the north end of that one, and that's on the coastal plain, and it's about 6 miles deep, 6 or 7 miles from the edge of Tokyo Bay to where the mountains start.
Okay.
There's flat ground, and that's where a whole lot of their industry was, especially their war industry was built on that coastal plain. Aircraft factories, and shipyards, and tank factories, and big gun artillery producing factories and ammunition and all of that business. And them B-29s had come from Tinian Island with their 2,000-pound blockbuster bombs, and they dropped one on every square yard of that coastal plain. There wasn't anything higher than this table on that whole coastal plain. It had just leveled everything.
I have a question.
Okay.
How come I've never seen a picture, or was there not ever a picture made of you and Bub in your uniform together?
We were never together in our uniform.
Really?
We went to, I called him. He was at Terminal Island,
Yeah.
and I was at San Diego Naval Training Station.
Okay.
And I called him 3 or 4 times, and made an appointment with him to meet me on the steps of the Army Navy YMCA in San Diego on Sunday afternoon.
Okay.
And I went there 2 successive Sunday afternoons and spent all day sitting on them steps waiting for him. He never got there.
Oh, really?
And so we never encountered each other. By the time I got back from boot camp,
Yeah.
he was home as a
Really?
civilian.
Uh-huh. I just wondered about that. I got to think about that. I don't remember.
I had a picture, some pictures of him in his uniform, but not with me. But they were lost in the flood.
Right.
That's Noah's flood. But we went into Tokyo, and of course Tokyo was devastated. They had cleared the streets of rubble so that they could pull their rickshaws around the streets, but most of the buildings were just piles of rubble. And they were working at restoring some of them, or rebuilding or something. They had these bamboo scaffolds, you know, and they had dug through the piles of rubble, and they had tunnels that was shored up with timbers so that you could get through from one place to another where the rubble was too deep to move. But you could walk down these streets, some of them that the street and the sidewalks had been cleared. You could walk down the sidewalk in downtown Tokyo, and if you met a Japanese coming towards you on the sidewalk, they would get off in the gutter and bow when you walked by, because we were wearing U.S. uniforms, and we were the occupation forces. And of course, they don't do that anymore.
No, they push you out of the way.
They push you out of the way and go where they want to go. But they learned that on their train platforms, you know, when they got those high-speed trains in Japan. And people, the cars were designed to carry 60 people, and they could put 600 of them on there because they had pushers on the platforms, you know. And people would gang up at the doors when the train stopped, and them pushers would push them in there so the doors could close. And that's how they grew up. The current generation, and they just push and shove. Man, it beats all I ever saw in my life.
Did you come in contact with any previous soldiers of the Japanese military? Or?
If I did, I wasn't aware of
Okay.
it.
Is that right?
I know after I went to work at the refinery, Magnolia Refinery, we had people out there. There were two men in particular, pipe fitters, that the company wouldn't allow them to work on the wharf there at the Magnolia Refinery, where the Magnolia tankers tied up and loaded or unloaded their cargo. Because if they were on the wharf and one of those Japanese freighters came up the river going to the port of Beaumont to buy scrap iron, those guys would throw every tool they had at them when they went by.
Really?
They would scream and curse and throw anything they could pick up.
Huh. Is that right?
Yeah.